Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, and thank you for attending this first lecture of our program on ancient cultures of the Old World. The Old World meaning Eurasia, primarily, and back in the 1700s and perhaps even the 1600s, people in Europe started calling the Western Hemisphere the New World, so that means that they're the Old World. I am delighted to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Professor Florin Curta. He's a professor in the history department at UF, where he has been teaching since 1999. He doesn't look that old. His research has focused on the history and archaeology of the Middle Ages of Eastern and Southeastern Europe, including the Byzantine Empire between 500 and 1250 AD, or current era, CE. He's a popular teacher and a prolific writer, having published an astonishing 24 books. That's almost a book a year. Professor Curta has received multiple awards for his work. He took his PhD from Western Michigan University, while he is originally from Bucharest, Romania. He's an honorary member of the Romanian Academy. He will speak to us this afternoon about the Neolithic period in the Balkan Peninsula, when agriculture first developed around 8,000 years ago, and the significant sociological changes that followed. So please welcome Professor Curta.
Thank you very much. Let me say a few words before I start so that you...
And excuse me, turn off your cell phones or silence them. Thank you.
So that we are, let's put it this way, on the same page geographically, but also chronologically. I don't think that I need to explain that the Balkans is one of the three peninsulas in the southern part of Europe. But perhaps this Neolithic element, thank you, the Neolithic element needs to be explained a little bit more. It's a neologism, a new word. I didn't check its entry in Oxford English Dictionary, but I would bet that is no younger than maybe 1860s, 1870s. And it's a word created from two Greek words, lithos, which is stone, and neo, which is new. So you have Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic. It's probably going to leave it, this idea of three ages, stone, bronze, and iron, goes back to a Danish archaeologist of the early 19th century. And throughout that century, so up to the point where Neolithic came to be used as a term, the first age, the Stone Age, was subdivided into early, middle, and new. So I'm going to talk about the new one. Why not about the Paleolithic? Why not about the Mesolithic? And so, be very interesting lectures too. But since the topic of the series is old civilization or civilization in the old world, the word civilization implies that there are changes taking place that somehow, in one way or another, relate to what we are and what we think nowadays. If we would have a time machine and we'd be able to travel just a few days to the Paleolithic one trip, to the Mesolithic second trip, and to the Neolithic a third trip, I bet you most of you would say, sign me up for Neolithic. I don't want to have to do with the hunter-gatherers and all that stuff. It's a form of life that is very foreign to what we do. Yet, as I will argue, many of the things that we do, although we don't think of them that way, were established in the transformations taking place, not just in the economy, in the subsistence, but also in the mode of organization of society. It came about in this new Stone Age, or later part of the Stone Age. So what we know as Neolithic, once again, the late Stone Age, is as the name goes, it seems there to be something to do with the fact that the tools are all made of stone. Thomson, the Danish archaeologist I mentioned earlier on, divided iron, bronze, stone, bronze, and Iron Age into those three ages based on the materials used for manufacturing tools and later weapons. So Neolithic would fall under the assumption that most tools would be made of stone. That's not false, it's true. But the importance of the age has to do with something else, namely to what I hinted at, the transition to a new mode of subsistence. I mentioned to you that if you would travel as a group or individual to the Paleolithic back in time, you'd not like it too much. First of all, it's pretty tiresome. I had to walk around all the time. And since the subsistence is based on hunting and gathering, you depend on the resources on doing that almost on a daily basis, right? When you switch from that to a new form of subsistence, the one that I would introduce you to today, agriculture, there's something that happens that has a tremendous significance, as you will see, or what I'm going to argue in this lecture. If you're doing agriculture on a constant basis, that is to say, you're not just harvesting things that you could eat on a seasonal basis, but you stay on the same area, cultivate crops there, you would produce more than you can eat. Depending, of course, on the season, the harvest, and so on and so forth, but that means that you can store that food, implying that you could actually project activities in the future, be that a feast or be that a tribute paying to whatever. In other words, because of that surplus, you can actually think right now of new forms of organizing society. That's not possible when the form of subsistence is hunting and gathering. Which is to say that most of the sophisticated, elaborated, complicated, complex, let's put it this way, forms of social organization cannot exist without agriculture. That's why Neolithic. So this transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture is a fundamental change. And people working in the sense of archaeologists excavating sites that will have relevance for what I'm going to tell you today recognize this very early. Let me start with probably one of the most famous from that point of view. He was actually born in Australia, but everybody knows Vere Gordon Childe as a British archaeologist. Most people who know a little bit about the history of the discipline of archaeology, that is, also know him as probably the most Marxist of all. Vere Gordon Childe actually had a fond spot for Soviet archaeology in the early developments in the 20s and 30s, and was influenced by its ideas, specifically derived from Marxist philosophy, that all changes, put it very simplistically, come internally, not from the outside. Okay, as you will see, that actually has implications for how to explain what happened during this age. So from a Marxist point of view, Vere Gordon Childe was quite successful in arguing that what happened in the Neolithic age was a revolution. That in itself will tell you it's a red flag. That's Soviet lingo, right? Soviet era lingo, at least. Now, revolution in this case, don't think of the Bolshevik Revolution, the French Revolution, because obviously the changes I'm going to talk about did not happen all at once. In fact, he used that word to imply, to refer instead to the implications of those changes for human society. No, I did not bring this slide to actually tell you that I'm either fond of Vere Gordon Childe and his theories or of Marxism, but I'm going to tell you that his ideas were very influential until quite recently. As you will see, not much of what he had to say back in the 30s about this actually stays in place, but it's good to start with who said what to give you a sort of a context. Now, it became clear since then that most of the tools in use during the early part of Neolithic, right at the beginning of this late stage of the Stone Age, were actually known since the Mesolithic. So if you look from a strictly Marxist point of view, there were no changes in the mode of production, specifically in tools. in other words, the changes that really happened in Neolithic did not happen because of what Marxists would call infrastructure. There's something else going on there. The introduction of agriculture, on the other hand, and we know this from recent excavations in Serbia, of all places, did not stop hunting and gathering, simply because they switched seasonally, permanently to agriculture. Communities, at least in the Balkans, do not seem to have actually stopped the old ways of obtaining food via hunting, specifically. And in fact, we do know that that is true also for communities outside the Balkan Peninsula, which is the focus of my lecture today. Communities in what is today Israel, communities in what is today Turkey, and communities in what is today Syria. So within the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea, similarly switched to agriculture, but only, I must say partially, but did not actually abandon the old ways completely. So I guess that given the context that I gave to you here and the ideological push coming with Beer, Gordon, and Child, the great question, the elephant in the room, if I may put it this way, was agriculture invented in Europe, or did it come from the outside? Right? And in fact, that's what Beer, Gordon, Child was struggling with when he came up with this idea of Neolithic Revolution. He was basically saying that, as I explained to you, in a Marxist mode of thinking, all change happens from inside rather than coming from the outside. So he was basically trying to say that in Europe, this was created by internal changes. Something had happened with communities in the Mesolithic, in the Middle Stone Age, that helped with the transformation for the Iron Age. Now, the earliest evidence of Neolithic with agriculture was long viewed as that of Greece. In fact, that was, at the time Beer, Gordon, Child wrote his book, the very basis for assessing the beginnings of the age. However, in the 1960s, a number of sites in the so-called Iron Gates segment of the Danube, right there where Skela Kladove, marked in red, is put on a map. That's the present-day border between Romania and Serbia. It's also the place where the Carpathian Mountains make a bend, cross the Danube, to make a wonderful gorge there through which the Danube flows eastwards. The site marked in red is Skela Kladove. A little further to the northwest is Ostrovo Banuri. A little further down south is another site called Iguana, all dated shortly before 6000 BC, showing that local communities fished intensively, hunted extensively, and may have used intensively or even cultivated plant resources, cereals, let's put it this way, although it's a controversy right now whether this is actually something that they cultivated or they harvested. It's not quite clear. One of the most interesting sites ever since, in fact, the 1930s became famous worldwide, in Europe, but worldwide. In the 60s, when I mentioned this region of Europe showed up as a possible core for the rise of Neolithic with agriculture, is Lepenski Vir. There are 8 stratified levels on the site there. And so, the excavation itself would go several meters underneath, of which 2 are dated to phase 3, which is recognizably early Neolithic, because the pottery is specific for a culture in the area. I use culture in our archaeological sense of that word, as the set of assemblage is typical for a certain area. The culture in question here is Starcevo Križ, which is very easily recognizable in the pottery. I should have mentioned that another major innovation of the age, I'm going to come to that a little later in the lecture, is the invention of pottery. As to say, most of the liquids or other needs of transportation, storage, and consumption in the earliest ages, we don't know much, but probably if they were fulfilled in any shape or form, they were not by means of vessels made of clay. This is actually a Neolithic invention. So one of the earliest types of pottery that we know in Europe is the one that was found in those two levels at the Lepenski Vir phase 3 associated with the Starchevo-Krish culture. And what is very interesting is that there are a few potsherds found on the site of the so-called monochrome pottery. Those are found in the first phase. Those would be levels 3 to 5 on the site. Now, I mentioned levels and stratigraphy and whatnot. I'm not sure how familiar you are with the principles of archaeology. Basically, everything that is deeper is older, obviously. But how old in absolute terms, we don't know. So ever since the 60s, there has been quite a range of attempts, and more recently re-attempts to date those sites by means of radiocarbon. As you probably know, William Libby, who invented the radiocarbon analysis, got the Nobel Prize for Chemistry in, I believe, 1951. So radiocarbon dates for Lepenski Vir, specifically for the first two phases there, indicate 5400 to 4600 BC. So in a way, why is that significant? I'll explain in a moment. In a way, this actually brought to light the fact that changes such as agriculture, that I mentioned was adopted in the area there, coincided with those known from early 20th century from excavations in Greece. I guess what I'm trying to say is that Lepenski Vir coincided in time as a site with the earliest Neolithic sites in Greece that were known to Vir Gordon Child as well. What was Lepenski Vir actually? It was a very large settlement. Let's see. It's a very large settlement built on a series of terraces above the Danube. It's very close in the section of the Danube I mentioned to you is called Iron Gates. There were about 20 structures, trapezoidal in form, in shape, in plan, each between 5 and 30 square meters of floor area. They all have plastered floors. And probably each one of them, as I'm trying to explain through this reconstruction, the site could be, there's a wonderful museum there organized by the Serbs, refurbished just a few years ago. Yes. Yeah. Would that be good? All right, perfect. I'll try to actually use it in the left hand so that I can switch the slides with my right. All right. So there were about 20 houses, if you want to call them that way, each one with a floor area between 5 and 30 square meters. The floor was plastered, quite clear an indication of some kind of care, at least for insulation, if not for aesthetic needs. And each one of them covered by this tent-like wooden superstructure, remains of which were found in excavations, with a rectangular stone-lined hearth inside. In other words, those are houses, at least in the sense that some fireplace was there, either for heating or most likely for cooking as well. Some of the boulders in the hearths, in the fabric, in the construction of the hearths, have, I don't know how to call it. It's not a real sculpture, but it's semi-representational carvings. Usually you have human faces combined with the features of fish and with the curvy linear designs, so decorative intentions for sure. Around the hearth and sometimes on the floor, bones of fish, bones of red deer and of dog were found. Several of the structures therefore allow us to figure out not just how they lived, but also what they ate. But at least in the case of the dogs, it's hard to actually make the case that they actually ate dog meat. We're probably dealing with offerings. In other words, besides pottery, besides agriculture and the social changes that I will mention a little later, there's another major innovation in the Neolithic age, religious behavior. Most of the red deer bones that I mentioned earlier on are actually antlers, skulls, and shoulder blades. In other words, there's a selection of which part of the animal which was killed and butchered were actually offered, not the entire body and not all parts. Now, how human remains were also found between those structures. Some of them placed in pits, which are similar to the plan of the houses, trapeze-like. Sometimes they are they're placed just across the paving besides the hearth. One of those burials found at Lepensky Vir, in fact, that's the one shown right here, sorry. One of them is of an old man buried with the head, just the head of an old woman, not the entire skull of the woman, minus the lower jaw, and the skull of the woman is placed on his left shoulder. On the opposite shoulder, the right shoulder, there's a skull of an aurochs. It's a wild animal similar to the buffalo that is now extinct in the area, but exists further up north in Poland. And there was also a deer skull by his right hand with antlers nearby. I mean, whatever you think the meaning of all this is, your guess is as good as mine. There's a ton of literature on exactly what's happening here. But I don't want to insist upon this right now. We can talk in the Q&A section if you want. What I want to point out, however, is quite clearly we're talking about symbolic behavior. That's what I mean by religious acts being also an innovation of the age. The emphasis on ritual and burial suggests the site was not used for domestic purposes, and evidence of domestication of animals, specifically pigs, and for the cultivation of plants, wheat in this case, dates only from phase 3, right? So the settlement was used from earlier on, but only in phase 3 we see those changes that I mentioned to you would justify V.R. Gordon Child's emphasis on revolution, right? Just give you a sense of how it may have looked like. A reconstruction is good to get the deer there, get a burial marked with stones, the activities that I mentioned to you earlier on, and of course, the landscape of the Iron Gates, which is, as I said, gorge. All right. What was happening in Greece about the same time? Since I mentioned the sites in the Iron Gates segment of the Danube having discovered in the 1960s invited, specifically after the radiocarbon dates were obtained from there, invited comparison with what was known from decades before that to V.R. Gordon Child as well about Greece. We were talking about what was going on in Greece around 6000 BC. Up to the early 20th century, up to the age of V.R. Gordon Child writing about this stuff, a hypothesis of diffusion was developed. Once again, I don't know how much you know about the history of archaeology, but in the late 19th and throughout the 20th century, there's been two schools of thought basically explaining change in any place and at any time in the history of humankind. It could be by ideas being, so to speak, traveling from one person to another, but not the persons, right? So we learn that our neighbors did something that's innovative, new. We go there, we talk to them and come back and do the same thing. And this is how change spreads, right? That's diffusion. And migration with entire groups of people moving from place to place and replacing, so to speak, not just the local culture changing, therefore, but the argument goes the population as well. So by the time we're talking about here, the time the excavations in Greece started in earnest, the idea was that Neolithic farmers in Greece appeared not by means of people moving, but by diffusion. They have learned that something like that was happening maybe on the other side of the Aegean Sea, learning to do it, and they've done it in their own place. Now, interest in this explanation began to fade away exactly at the time of the discoveries in the Iron Gates segment of the Danube. So in the 1960s, in conjunction with the work of two archaeologists, one of Serbian origin, Vladimir Milojicic, and the other one of Greek origin, Demetrios Theoharis, both of them challenging the idea that this was diffusion and bringing up arguments that it may have been something else. Milojicic, the Serbian archaeologist at that time, Yugoslav, I should say, excavated a site. This is Argisa Magula, to be more exact, and then excavated also Otsaki. You have his name there as well, if you want to retain it. Both of them in Thessaly, so in the central northern part of Greece. Theoharis, the Greek archaeologist I mentioned in the same place, excavated at Sesklo, also in the area of Thessaly. Sesklo, I think, is the closest to the main city in Thessaly, Volos, nowadays. Because of this, while the discussion about archaeology, the archaeological evidence in the northern part of the Balkans, right at the border between Serbia and Romania, goes on in relation to the site at Lepenski Vir, here, Thessaly, in Greece, Thessaly was viewed as the launch pad for the diffusion of what was still known as the Neolithic Revolution into southeastern Europe. Viewed as sort of like a gateway for the spread of Neolithic innovations to the rest of Europe. I draw up a parenthesis here. That's why I chose to talk about the Neolithic in the Balkans, because since the 1960s, this peninsula, this area, this region has been at the center of these discussions. How did Neolithic reach England or Scandinavia, for example, right? The argument in the 60s had to go first through the southeastern part of the continent, through the Balkans. So the Balkans learned first how to do agriculture before the rest of Europe. That was the argument back then. Okay? Now, those sites in Thessaly, in Greece, that I just introduced to you, encouraged the shift of the explanation, of the explanatory focus away from diffusion, which I mentioned was the standard paradigm of explanation, of interpretation earlier on, and towards the idea that no, it was not the idea that was a migration of people coming from otherwise. I draw a parenthesis here. There's no surprise that this change in interpretation was brought up by a Serbian and by a Greek archaeologist. At the time we're talking about here in the 1960s, there are serious tensions between Yugoslavia on one hand and the rest of the communist bloc. The Yugoslavs wants to do things on their own, independent. And there are also tensions, not unrelated to this, between Greece and Turkey. So the two archaeologists want to emphasize that everything that was believed to have come by word of mouth from somewhere else is actually a local invention. So Milojicic and Theoharis put forward the idea that indigenous Mesolithic populations of hunters and gatherers, as it were, began to experiment with agriculture and to adopt selectively elements from neighboring agricultural economy. So they may have learned that somebody was already doing this stuff here, but they did not need to be taught by them, you see. They're proud to actually invent agriculture all by themselves. This came to be known as the indigenist hypothesis. And it is, as I hope I conveyed to you, as much influenced by nationalism and the emerging self-consciousness in the post-war Balkans than it is by the archaeological evidence. Now, all of this changed another 20, 25 years later when a book was published, 1984, by Albert Emmerman and Luigi Cavallo Sforza. And the first one was actually an American-born archaeologist, one of the first one to have actually dabbled into genetics, what we call nowadays ancient DNA. And Cavallo Sforza was actually a biologist, so very interested in implementing on the archaeological thinking, modes of understanding the spread that are typical for plants and animals. Their book was quite a splash. It was a book about the Neolithic transition, in exactly the point of my lecture, in which they introduced a, should I say, third way or fourth way even, neither diffusion nor indigenous hypothesis, nor migration outright. They call it the wave of advance model. And what it meant was that, first of all, let me say that the pendulum in terms of interpretation began to swing back. And now the Neolithic economy of agriculture and village life appeared to have been introduced to the Greek mainland, not by migration at one moment in time from across the Aegean Sea, but what I call demic diffusion, which nonetheless originated, so they argued, in Turkey, on the southern coast around what is today Antalya. So what they were basically saying is that instead of a group migrating from Antalya all the way to Sesklo, say, for example, we're talking about people who moved not too much away from their initial location, maybe a few kilometers and another few kilometers a generation later, and another few kilometers. That's what they meant by the wave of advance. This advance in such small units of movement was justified by their needs, their subsistence economy being based on agriculture. They will put to work new fields after a certain periods of time of cultivating the same crops on the same field, which have exhausted the nutrients from the soil. Now, the first appearance of a number of characteristic features of the Neolithic economy of agriculture has been attested ever since 1984 to this day in one of the most interesting sites in Greece. Unlike the previous sites, this is in Argolid, in the northeastern part of Peloponnesus, in a cave at Frankti. The beginning of the Neolithic is defined in terms of artifacts found on the site there by the additions of polished stone axes. This is the cave, to give you a sense of the landscape, and some of the axes that were found. As you can tell, those are small tools, right? In other words, we're moving away from the big stone tools that were typical for the Paleolithic age. Now, those would be grinders, stone grinders, or a variety of bone awls and shells, stone beads, things like that. The pottery associated with those tools is pretty simple and monochrome. And it has, as you can tell from a few reconstruction, there are globular forms, usually bowls, some cups with the footed cups, right? Now, this pottery was certainly not used for cooking. I go back to something that I said earlier on about Le Penskivir. And the pots are too few and too small for storage. Once again, we come back to this idea that the evidence that we have seems to imply a very sophisticated set of rituals, the meaning of which, remains to be discussed, of course. In other words, those vessels were used for ritual processing of plants, right? A French archaeologist working on the site ever since the 1970s, Catherine Perlet, even dared to actually put forward the hypothesis, I tend to agree with her, that those who produced and employed this pottery were what might be called ritual healers. In other words, there's plants that were processed on the site, most likely for, I don't know how to call it, medical, maybe healing purposes. There is indeed evidence of a Neolithic economy of agriculture on sites which have not produced pottery remains. It's a very interesting idea. It became clear in the 90s that not every site that has evidence for agriculture has also evidence of pottery, and vice versa. Those are two innovations of the Neolithic, but they're not necessarily linked to each other. In fact, in Thessaly, the sites that I mentioned to you earlier on are the so-called, what is called an aceramic Neolithic, and similar sites are known in Crete, Knossos, for example. Now, at both Sesklo and Knossos, despite the absence of pottery, of vessels, we do have clay processed, but not in the form of vessels, but in the forms of figurines. Remember, I mentioned the boulders of Lepensky Vir, some of them carved in look like human shape. I mean, we have something completely different here, not made of stone, but made of clay. The form of human heads or of females standing, squatting, or sitting with arms folded on hips or outstretched with bland facial features, but exaggerated lower limbs and sexual parts. A late example from Dikilitash, which is also in Thessaly, is a lozenge-shaped face of a man, which is the one that you see on the right. So there's a lot already to unpack here, exactly what's going on in terms of the changes. Needless to say, irrespective of what you think the significance of those statues is, we're talking about a society that must have had at least two groups of people, maybe not ranked, but I like the imagination of it. Some that actually produced the food and some that actually got busy into the healing and the ritual activities and something like that. Not necessarily the same people at the same time. Non-pottery ceramic remains on those sites also consist of miniature tables. Some would go as far as to say maybe those are altars. And there are also small house models or shrine models, what some would say. Some of them painted in red. Probably one's most famous is the one in Kranon. But as you can see, the table at Tsangli, it's quite interesting. Those are two sites in Thessaly near Kardica. The pottery begins when it starts appearing on the sites in Greece with hemispherical or globular bowls, such as you saw from the Frankti cave, jars in a plain ware, followed by what is known as the proto-Sesklo pottery, which is painted. Let me give you some examples so that you can see quite clearly there's a jump here. Already they have a very complex understanding of the decoration, of the decorative patterns, I should say. Zigzags, chevrons, triangles, lozenges. Then there is a pre-Sesklo phase, which is completely monochrome, with some pots decorated with the impressions. And finally, the true Sesklo phase, with a great quantity of red on white painted pottery, later gray on gray, white on black, or scraped ware, such as this. So we're not even talking anymore by with or without pottery. Clearly, different. I mean, let me open up a parenthesis. It doesn't make any difference from a purely functional point of view whether you paint those pots or not. A mug is a mug. In other words, the fact that you take the paint to decorate the pot is an indication that there's a message to be transmitted. Once again, I'm gonna engage and try to explain what that message is. Your guess is as good as mine or anybody else's. I would just want to point out the fact that the desire to decorate the pot is an indication of a very sophisticated organization of society, even if we're talking about just plain pots, right? Pottery is actually a very good indication of the changes taking place in society. Further up to the north from Thessaly, in what is Greek Macedonia nowadays, so the area around and north of Thessaloniki, the earliest Neolithic sites with pottery, Nea Nicomedia, for example, or Servia, do not have the monochrome pottery. In southern Greece, so south from Thessaly, the Middle Neolithic coincides with the appearance of rainbow wares, such as those from Corinth, and black on white, lustrous, so-called Urfirnis, this is German term, pottery. There are some similarities, as you can tell, but also differences. And, it becomes, the most important question to be asked here is that, do those differences in style mean anything than just aesthetic preferences? Does the fact that you drink your coffee from a mug in the proto-Sesklo type indicate something about your affiliation to a group, maybe? To a rank group, maybe? That's a question that remains without answer for the moment. All those pots, however, seem to have served non-domestic functions, as the first cooking pots actually appear only at the end of the Middle Neolithic. I don't have to put it this way. You can think of it as what's common nowadays, the internet, right? The web, started as an invention for the military before being turned into civilian use, right? If I may use that parallel here, pottery to be used for cooking or eating started with the ritual use. It was not domestic and then specialized use for whatever rituals there, quite the opposite. The layout of the settlements on which these pots were found is also something that is worth a discussion here. I mentioned Argisamagula and Hileon. The early levels had scoops or pit dwellings. I also mentioned Nea Nicomedia. You have the aerial view of the excavations in the 70s on that side there, continuing in the 90s. I don't know if you can make it, but there's a cluster of 6 buildings around a large structure, possibly a shrine. In other words, we're talking about the organized layout, may I risk to say, pre-planned layout of those settlements. At Otsaki, we have an increasing coherence of that layout with closely spaced rectangular buildings separated by narrow lanes. At Seskolo, a site I mentioned so many times in this lecture already, there's even an acropolis, that is to say, a highly elevated portion of the site there, with marked by a ditch, perimeter retaining walls, and an internal enclosure. The enclosure contained one large building, several small ones, and the paved courtyard, quite clearly marking that building as separate from the rest of it. At Hatsimisiotoki, Magula, and Sufli, 2 other sites that are not mentioned yet, we even have well-defined boundaries or possibly defenses, we're not quite sure, in the form of either stone walls or deep V-shaped ditches. So I wanted to show you that what way back in the 1920s, 1930s, Vir Gordon-Child mentioned as a revolution, having in mind infrastructure, Marxist kind of driven arguments, turns out to be quite different animal, so to speak. And there's no way to escape the implication of what I said so far, that many of those innovations seem to have had a religious aspect connected to them. Now, inside those settlements, the basic architectural unit is the single-roomed 4-walled building with normally stone footing and mud bricks. There is even evidence of 2-story buildings. House 11 and 12 in Seskolo had a pottery store and a workshop in one of its 2 basements. And at Otsaki's, houses with internal buttresses for an upper floor were found as well. Exactly what it meant to live in a house with an upper story. Once again, I let your imagination fly. There's a lot that we can unpack on this probably at the discussion following my lecture. All right. Remember, I started with a Marxist emphasis on economy, on infrastructure. So much religion, so much cult, so much ritual here. What did those people eat? What was the economy all about? Did anything change since Vir Gordon-Child wrote about this? Now, it's quite clear that the economy was based on cereals. The species have been identified. There has been tremendous progress in paleobotany, in the study of usually charred seeds found in silos on either inside the houses, such as this, or next to them. And we have been able to identify the species on a variety of sites. We're talking emmer, einkorn, and breadwheat. But barley is, I say it in the plural because there are different species. Barley is 2-row and 6-row hulled or naked barley are also used. What about animals? There's been some very interesting research done on this, specifically using isotope analysis. You probably are familiar with the fact that isotope analysis has been used extensively on human skeletons. roughly speaking, and to explain it, in the first years of your life, a tissue was placed on the teeth, which, by the way, have the strongest bone tissue in the entire body. The entire skeleton may decompose in the burial pit there. The teeth will stay. And based on that tissue on top of your teeth, one could tell nowadays where exactly the region, not particularly the place you were born. Because of the strontium, the isotope analysis done on oxygen as well, does not have a uniform spread on planet Earth. And because of that, you can spot wherever you came from. And the same kind of analysis could be done on animals. And you remember, the argument of the indigenous hypothesis was that the Mesolithic hunters and gatherers adapted, so to speak, invented by themselves the Neolithic there. If so, could they have, I don't know, domesticated aurochs to turn into ox? How about the sheep, right? The analysis of the earliest skeletal remains of animals from those settlements I mentioned to you here show that most likely those species originated from the other side of the Aegean Sea. Be that as it may, sheep and goats, mostly, especially on lowland sites, but cattle also, such as in Serbia at the higher elevation there, or in Greece at Argisa, which is very interesting. At Argisa, the skeletons of cattle, of bovines, were dated earlier than those in the Near East. However, the sheep bones in the Near East are earlier than those in Greece. Pig, quite absent in Greece. You have to go up to the north. Penskivir gave some examples of that, but the most or the closest to Greece are those in Macedonia, in the hinterland of the city of Thessaloniki. So by 4500 BC, let me put it this way, there is a quite clear picture that we get here. We also get a larger number of settlements by that time, which implies that we have an expansion from the south, most likely, to the central and northern parts of Greece. In Thessaly, which is somewhere in the middle, the systematic field surveys. So excavations have been done, but field surveys, like all of us will go in a field, each one of us will take a transect, and we're not going to look just within the transect given to us, over the shoulders to each other to figure out potsherds. And then we map them and figure out exactly where could the settlement have been. Potsherds are brought to the surface by agricultural work. They're not going to be dragged by the plow too far away from where they have been taken. So, statistically speaking, using probability, you can figure out exactly where the site might be. And sometimes analyzing just the potsherds found on the surface could give you a lot of information. So in Thessaly, such systematic field surveys revealed the occupation of the dry eastern plain and the occupation of marginal lands. In other words, by now, the area that is fertile, easy to cultivate, is already occupied. People are pushed to the margins, right? Are making an extra effort to cultivate lands that would have actually they would not have been interested earlier on. This also coincides with the beginning of settlement on several islands in the Aegean. Saliagos in the Cyclades is a good example of that. This is right before year 4000 BC. One of the most impressive aspects of this, should I say, later phase of the development of Neolithic is what came to be known as a tell sites. A tell is actually a mound. It could start with a small natural mound, but the size at which a tell exists nowadays, right before excavation, which is basically a hill in the middle of nowhere, right, is the result of accumulation of dirt on top of which new faces of the same settlement were built. And northern Greece has some of the most famous such tell sites, Sitagri and Dikilitash. I mentioned, you saw the lozenge-shaped face of a human made of clay from Dikilitash site. That's a tell site. So most settlements in Thessaly were subdivided by walls or ditches to be separated from into domestic areas on one side, or courtyard groups, if you wish, containing both indoor and outdoor facilities. That takes me to the very end of the Neolithic, not of my lecture, but just want to say that by the time we are done, chronologically speaking, with this young or recent or new Stone Age, external cooking facilities were enclosed within yard walls. I don't know if you try to think of it, what does that mean? So a outdoor baking oven, right there, to bake bread, right, is not just for everyone, but there's a wall around it. Any guesses what that could mean? Private property. It's my oven. You're not allowed to come. I cook my bread here. You cook yours in your yard, right? So it's quite clearly an indication of what I said. It's something that would make a trip to the Neolithic age via time machine a lot more familiar than for the Paleolithic age, which knew no private property whatsoever. Now, this sequence of changes that I described to you briefly, because there's a lot more to unpack here, has been interpreted as a shift from a social pattern characterized by the sharing of food, hence my emphasis on the lack of private property in Paleolithic and Mesolithic, usually sharing of food among neighbors, to a more private life focused on individual families. This is confirmed by the gradual disappearance of finely decorated tableware, perhaps indicating that hospitality was less strongly prescribed. That's one possible interpretation, but it's quite an interesting one. There's evidence of contacts between the western and the eastern shores of the Aegean Sea precisely at this moment in time. Remember, I mentioned that isotope analysis shows very interestingly that the sheep in Greece are newer, more recent than the ones in the Near East. The cattle in Macedonia is dated much earlier than that in the Near East. So don't think of this as being a diffusion. You start from place A and everything moves one direction only to place B. There's contact both ways, right? But quite clearly, there is contact. How do we know this? We have the painted pottery that repeats some of the patterns that exist in the Near East as well. The clay figurines with sheet-shaped eyes that you see here appear in the Near East as well. Human-shaped pots, the so-called Hasuna type, most likely an invention from the Near East, traveling to the Greece as well. My favorite is the pottery with scraped decoration. You saw an earlier example of that, but this is incised ornament filled with white. Probably the best example of this is from Dimini, but the earliest example of that is from Mersin in what is today Turkey. Speaking of Turkey, the Beyt Sultan, we have evidence of black pottery with burnished decoration. It's quite complicated process of manufacturing pottery, which appears in Greece as well. And I should actually end on a note that will announce future topics in your series here. The Megaron type of house. Think of Ulysses coming back home and seeing all those guests eating at his table and courting his wife. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Questions, comments? Oh, lots of questions. Okay, we'll start here and go over there.
You referred to the rise of, or the origin of religious practices. Does that also correspond to the rise of our priestly class?
Excellent question. I use religion in a very broad sense. I specifically avoided the adjective organized, modifying the noun religion, which is exactly what you had in mind. You want to stretch the argument that the megaron like this was used for cult? Quite possible. My mind goes right now to the fact that in the much better documented Viking Age society in Scandinavia, we don't have any evidence of priests, but we do have evidence of ritual activities in the houses of the great lords. Or if you want to put it this way, a great Viking chief was a priest as well. Is this something similar here? Maybe, but there is no evidence of a priestly class whatsoever.
You did mention the production of excess resources, of excess food that's stored for the next season. Where there's an excess resource, then there could be a hierarchy to control that value. Because it becomes
it could be, but the simplest mechanism attested by anthropology for a situation like this is that, let's say we're all here part of the same community, and we practice agriculture, and we produce an excess, a surplus, let's put it this way. If we would think of some communal use of that surplus before even a hierarchy is formed, we will organize a party. We will do a feast. Now, somebody will have to be appointed, I should say, as the organizer, the leader of the organization of this. That person will say, what percentage of that surplus will be used for what? In time, for his efforts or her efforts. That person would be paid with a portion of the surplus. That's the moment when economic differences arise as well. But there is no evidence of hierarchy in a social, let's say, ranked society shape here. Sorry.
How similar is the development of the Neolithic in the areas you're talking about with areas like in Great Britain? I've been reading Ken Follett's book, and he talks about the hunter-gatherers, the herders, and the farmers as being existing at the same time.
Very good question. And indeed, before I answer directly your question, then let me say, I focused on the Neolithic communities here, but excavations show that in the Balkans, specifically in the Central Balkans, areas that are now Republic of North Macedonia and Serbia, communities of hunter and gatherers coexisted with those Neolithic people. I mean, with those agriculturists. It's not like once agriculture appeared there, the old ways disappeared. As I mentioned earlier on, there is evidence that the agriculturists themselves dabbled into hunting and gathering as well. The proportions of those activities by region vary enormously in Europe. You asked about England or the British Isles. There is quite evidence that there are two main pathways by which the agricultural kit or the Neolithic kit described to you here, pottery, agriculture, ritual activities, etc., travel to the northwest, north and northwest. One is along the Danube, the other one is through the Mediterranean Sea. Most likely, Britain was hit, quote unquote, by the transformations brought along the river Danube to Germany and then northwestern Germany across the channel. We do have in Britain much later development for obvious reasons than those in the Balkans here. But it's very interesting because when they reach a certain area, the transformations are basically similar. Obviously, the pottery will be different, right? Different decoration, maybe even different forms, shapes. But they are similar use. And what is interesting in Britain is that the ritual use of pottery, before it was actually of domestic use, is a mirror of the development in the Balkans.
There was another question over here.
Thank you. It's been so interesting, but sometimes I had trouble following you because you speak very quickly. I think you said that decorated pottery was used for rituals before it was used for domestic use. And could you say why you believe that?
Well, the evidence is one that has to do with the content, either of the pots themselves found deposited on some sites, Sesklo is a good example of that, or nearby. As I mentioned to you, there is evidence of all the main cereals, different species of wheat, different species of barley that's being cultivated for subsistence. But the earliest pots that I mentioned as being decorated seem to have been used for doing things with plants that do not have a food value. They were actually most likely used for healing. That's what the implication is. Also, I should say, none of those pots were found by the hearth in the respective buildings. In other words, they're not used for cooking or eating. Beyond that, I think to be frank to you, the earliest interpretation of the pottery as ritual had to do with this shocking effect of the decoration. When I was talking, I raised my eyes when I brought the slide up. And when I brought on the slide the pottery with the checker like decoration, you're like, wow, because all the previous form was bland, were nothing special. So archaeologists, just like you, tend to attribute to ritual things that cannot explain easily in other forms. That was a joke on my profession.
Another question?
Thank you very much. This is kind of off the wall, but comparing, we tend to have a very ethnocentric view of the ancient world. I was wondering, comparing it with like China, we have our, idea of Cro-Magnon man and the Neanderthals and that. Did they develop agriculture before they did in the West, like with raising rice? Because you don't really hear much about ancient Chinese culture.
Speaker of China.
I was just about to say,
We'll see.
I am not a specialist in China, but top of my head, I could tell you that there is actually independent parallel development of Neolithic culture there as well. There's no influence from China to Europe or vice versa, as far as I know.
That's what I've read. And I've also read that rice was originally cultured in Southeast Asia. Anybody else?
Yeah.
Oh, always. Yep.
Yes. Thank you. Very interesting lecture. I would like to ask you about Thomas closer. Okay. About the Mesopotamia, where I think it was the first cultivation of grain. How many?
No.
No.
The first evidence of agriculture is the Natufian culture in what is today Israel. The invention of agriculture, or if you want to say the transition on an economic basis from Mesolithic to Neolithic, takes place in the Eastern Mediterranean area. And it's developed by the wave advance model that Cavalli Sforza put forward in 1840 in multiple directions, to the west, but also to the east. So I don't know, if you look on a map, as the crow flies, forget about the sea and all of that. It's much easier to get to Mesopotamia from what is today Israel than it is to get from Israel to what is today Greece.
So it's not in the, I'm referring to the Euphrates River.
Yeah,
that
that's
area.
not the original area. No, ma'am.
No culture there?
No, there is culture. No. What I meant is that the earliest, chronologically speaking, right, the earliest form of agriculture attested archaeologically speaking is that of the Eastern Mediterranean, not of Mesopotamia. What you know is that the large-scale cultivation of plants, of crops, using irrigation in areas that were not naturally favorable to the cultivation of crops is indeed that of Mesopotamia. But that's a later developed, Bronze Age.
Yeah, well, it just called my attention because Greece is not really, it's not a country that has a lot of rain and water, so how it develops.
Not in Thessaly. Thessaly is pretty yeah.
Okay, thank you.
We also have to remember the climate was very different then. Coming out of the last ice age, it was much wetter. The Sahara was.
That's why you can actually live better in caves than in the out there. It's cooler.
Okay, this is the last one.
You mentioned the pottery, and I wonder though, has weaponry been found in these sites or in the region? And if so, I see you're nodding your head, so yes, I assume. But if so, can any of it be identified as ritualistic weaponry or purely functional weaponry?
Unlike tools, I mean by that grinders and scrapers, and none of the arrowheads, which could be recognized very easily as being weapons, or other forms of blades, could be used to have knives, maybe a sword, I don't know, were, as far as I know, Sesklo, Otsaki, definitely not the Lepensky beer. None of them was found in what I may call the ritual environment. We do have evidence of hunting, and they must have used weapons for that.
I understand. I mean, I've been to Knossos in Crete, the palace of the Minoan kings on Crete, dating from 2200 BC. Interestingly, from what I've read, they've never found any weapons there, only ritual axes. Yeah. So it was possible to have non-violent societies.
Or at least one that did not display weapons, merely. They could not have left them there.
Yeah.
They could have had weapons, but not left them there.
So one last question. You showed an aerial photo of a dig site in Macedonia, Nicomedia.
Yep.
What was that dated? Was there a date associated with that?
Sure. Most of the sites that I mentioned to you were in existence around 5000 BC. Nea Nicomedia, the earliest phase, if I'm correctly remember, is 56,000. So just a little bit earlier.
5600. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your lecture. And thank you all for coming. Next Monday, we'll have Professor Alice Crow coming all the way from FSU in Tallahassee. And she's going to talk to us about the Bronze Age and how it collapsed. Thank you all very much.